Hello, and welcome to M4LU, presented by Moms for Liberty. We're here to translate complex topics into more easily understood content, giving you, the parents, grandparents, and every American citizen, the key facts and information you need to empower you to fight back against government overreach, especially as it impacts our kids in schools. Hi, I'm Melissa Karwowski, Program Director of M4LU. Each month, we'll focus on a single topic, ideology, or issue that impacts our kids, schools, and communities. We'll approach it from multiple angles, starting with a 101 intro lecture, followed by a 102 course that goes a little deeper on the topic. If available, we'll do a virtual watch party of a film relating to the topic, and finally culminate with a monthly book club discussion. Best of all, every event will have live Q&A with experts in the field to help us make sense of it all. We understand this can be a lot to digest, but don't worry, we've got your back. You'll find a corresponding toolkit in the resource library at m4lu.org. In addition to recordings of all monthly events, each toolkit will include a curated smart book, presentation slides that can be used at chapter meetings, related white papers, articles, podcasts, and so much more. Now, before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. Depending on what device you are using, there should be an audience chat and Q&A feature at the right of your screen. Please comment, interact with your fellow audience members, and be sure to submit those questions to our amazing guests. It is so valuable to get this direct interaction with them, so please take advantage of it. As a warning, rude or demeaning comments will get you removed from this event, and you will not be permitted to re-enter. Now, of course, the legal reminder that the opinions of the guests and any media content shared are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of M4LU or Moms for Liberty. Thank you so much for joining us today. Please like, share, and subscribe to help spread the word and support our mission. We try to keep our resources affordable and accessible to all, but if you would like to donate, please visit m4lu.org. Thank you again. Now let's jump over to the event. Hello again, and welcome to May with M4LU. I'm so glad that you have joined us for this very, very important month. This whole year has just been great already. We've covered some really good topics in January. We had SEL. In February, we talked about CRT and DEI. March, we moved on to restorative justice, which is unfortunately not very just. And then, of course, last month in April, we had gender ideology, which, as I shared before, that really was the topic that red-pilled me, that sent me down the rabbit hole. We had some great speakers, covered some really, really important information. I strongly encourage you to check out the Moms for Liberty YouTube channel. You can find recordings of all our events there and get to replay and revisit all of the fantastic events and review for information, just in case you need a refresher on it. So before we dive in for our new topic, in the month of May, it is CSE, or Comprehensive Sexuality Education. Now, gender ideology may have red-pilled me, but I will tell you, CSE, whatever could come after red pills, it's definitely what happened for me when I was researching for CSE. Before we really dive into it, though, let's take a minute and check in with Christy Slape from Williamson County, Texas, as our mom on a mission.
Howdy, y'all. This is Christy, mom on a mission with Moms for Liberty. Today, we're in Austin, Texas at the state capitol, asking people what they know about comprehensive sex education. Let's go. Hi, what is your name?
Maddie.
Maddie, it's nice to meet you. And who do you have with you?
This is my little Breeze.
Okay, hello. What's your name?
Pearl.
And Mark.
When you think of sex education, what do you think of?
Oh, that's a hot topic. I think it's something that needs to start in the home,
Okay.
not in the schools.
Okay. Do you feel like it's the place of schools to inundate children with sexual books and references all day in their classrooms?
I believe that there should be limitations in that.
And what is your name?
Edna.
Edna. And your name?
Elena.
Ramiro.
Do you all go to school in Mexico?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. When I was growing up, and maybe you too, if you learned about sex education in school, it was a very limited lesson about biology, and then everything else you just kind of figured out on your own, or you talk to your parents. Today, we have something more, it's called Comprehensive Sex Education, where just everything about sexuality is being infused into books in the school libraries. It's being infused into not only science, but math and history. And students are learning about these things that their parents honestly don't know that they're learning about. So do you think that that is too much for schools to go into those topics? Or do you think that the schools should just stick to teaching math and reading?
They should have like this balance on the sexual education and on math and on
balance, but not in matches or the exposed activity, sexual activity in their subjects. I think it's not necessary.
It is not necessarily. Well, I agree with you. What is your name?
Paula Blackman.
Paula, it's so nice to meet you.
Me too.
Thank you. Today we're asking people what they think about sex education in schools. What do you think of when you think of sex ed?
I think of sex ed as kind of a biology lesson, right? I mean, we have biology in all our bodies and chemistry, and it's something that happens as you age.
Do you think that schools, public schools, really just any school, should be teaching in the early elementary ages, or when do you think it's appropriate to introduce sex education to children?
So if we're talking about sexual relations, I think that should be done later.
Okay.
If we're talking about how your body changes as you grow older, I think it should be age appropriate. I mean, we know that in certain time frames, this is what's happening to a body. I know that as I grow older, right? Yeah. And I think that should be age appropriate for the kids with their parents, sitting at a very safe space and having those discussions. I learned from an encyclopedia.
I did too.
And that is not good either, right?
Do you think that in the state of Texas or anywhere in the country that young children starting in elementary school should be taught about anything related to sex in their schools?
I do not believe so.
And you believe that parents should be the one?
I think it's the parents' responsibility to do that, because you want to make sure that the same values that you have are passed down.
I think it should just be biology education, biology. What is, and like I said, chemistry. We're chemical experiments going on in here. And I think just understanding that is a way to, eat better, to exercise, to get, have these emotional connections with people.
Some people might say, well, what if the parents are not willing to talk to their kids about sex and the birds and the bees, as we used to call it, and they say we need kids to learn in school? What do you think about that?
Oh my gosh, right now there's so much on the internet that you can find that if they don't feel comfortable explaining it, there's all kinds of resources that they can pull up from and show them a video, just get themselves educated on how to do it if they don't feel comfortable doing it. But I really, really strongly feel that it needs to start in the home.
I have heard also people saying about, some of the books that are in schools. I know that's a whole other conversation about book banning and this and that, but there are books that are very graphic sexually that expose very young children to anal sex, oral sex, things that are way, inappropriate for their age, or at least the majority of parents, adults would think so. And those images can't get out of their mind. Do you think that that's harmful on that level?
It is. And I mean, again, age appropriate, open discussions, understanding what's going on. I do think that parents being involved in this is highly and mostly important.
Does the name Alfred Kinsey mean anything to you?
No.
He discovered, in his words, that children are sexual from birth. And what he did was he recorded activity between adults and young children, infants, 6 months of age and older, of adults basically raping young children and documenting it, basically with roots in pedophilia. So that research is what has perpetuated the sex education in the schools today. And so for people who are not aware, we say do the research and find out about Kinsey and Money. These are people who really they went off the deep end and they claimed more about children being sexual in a way to groom them. So I really appreciate your honest answers. This is a really hard topic, and honestly, it's hard for me to ask questions about it because it makes everybody a little bit uncomfortable. But would you agree that children should keep their innocence as long as possible?
Yeah.
Totally.
Like I said, well, if they can teach them, but like just basic male and female, because they will learn that eventually. They will realize that on their own as they grow. But for children, just keep them innocent, like basic.
Yes, keep them young. Do you think that children's innocence is being taken away from them in the current society?
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you for joining us for this segment of Mom on a Mission. For more information, visit m4lu.org, and we'll see you next month.
Well, as always, a huge thank you to our amazing Christy Slape for stepping out there and talking to those on the street. So now I'm going to ask you, the viewer, what do you know about sex ed? What do you know about CSE? And yes, there is a difference. So go ahead, take a minute and comment in the chat and interact, and maybe start submitting those questions too, just in case. I can tell you, I thought initially sex ed, well, it's a little bit of a biology study, and we get those weird medical diagrams, and everyone laughs a little bit uncomfortably, and then we move on. But that's not CSE, and it's definitely not the sex ed that your kids are learning in school or being taught in schools. Now I'm going to take a quick second and say tonight's show really is going to be PG-13. This, ironically, while this information is being taught in schools, you probably don't want your kids to see some of the things that we are going to talk about tonight, because we are going to address this very, very uncomfortable topic, very unfortunate topic, and it is pretty graphic. So in some situations, we'll keep it appropriate, but just wanted to give you a heads up. This month was honestly a bit challenging. It was very dark to research CSE, really go down that rabbit hole, and I can tell you that I learned way more about Alfred Kinsey than I ever wanted to know. Don't necessarily encourage you doing it. It's just a really strange guy, but he is unfortunately considered the father of the sexual revolution, and that really has warped American society and the world, and introduced an agenda to sexualize our children. So without further ado, I'd like to move on to introduce our first most amazing guest. Monica is a former comprehensive sex educator and Title X family planning training manager. She's trained by the LGBTQ plus community and Planned Parenthood. Her career in HIV prevention, comprehensive sex education, or CSE, and Title X training management lasted over a decade. However, she learned from her mentors that serving the marginalized meant only meeting them where they're at and then leaving them there. It was a combination of this philosophy, her experience in the community, her conversion to Christianity, and her personal story that prompted her to deeply question comprehensive sex education and its impact on the family. Please help me welcome Monica Cline. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you, Missy. All right. Well, my name is Monica Leal Cline, and I'm the founder of It Takes a Family. And I founded It Takes a Family because of my experience in the sex education and abortion industry. Many of these sex ed, quote unquote, experts believe that it's not a job's parent to teach their children about sex education because they don't know enough. They're not well equipped. They're not able to talk about it. They're uneducated. And so they call themselves the experts, and I say parents are the experts. Parents are the ones who are most equipped to talk to their children about sex education. And I founded It Takes a Family so that if parents feel that they don't know what to say to their children, they can call It Takes a Family. And I love to train parents so that you are leading your children from home and not relying on experts out in the community, in the medical community, or in schools. But that wasn't always my story. As Missy mentioned, I'm actually a former comprehensive sex educator. I started in, let me use my things here. I'm a former comprehensive sex educator. Here we go. There. This is my background in comprehensive sex education. My first job was with Algo Informecida. That was an HIV organization that was serving both people living with HIV, and we had an outreach team, which is where I worked, as an HIV prevention specialist. Algo stands for the Austin, and this is Austin, Texas, the Austin Latino, Latina, Lesbian, and Gay Organization. So my education at Algo Informecida didn't just teach me about how to prevent the spread of HIV and other STDs, but it also taught me about the gay community and gay sex. And I'll go more into detail about what I was taught at Algo Informecida. And as you see there on the slide, that it was for queer people of color for social change. And comprehensive sex education is also considered a tool for social change, and we'll get into what that means. After working at Algo Informecida for a few months, they said it was time for me to learn how to share the sex ed message with children. And so they sent me across the street to Planned Parenthood. And so I was never employed by Planned Parenthood, but I was trained by Planned Parenthood on how to share this message with children. Of course, you see that their logo is care no matter what. After that, I worked at the Right House Wellness Center, which is working with people who are living with HIV. And then I began to manage 2 new comprehensive sex education groups, one for men who have sex with men and the other one for women of childbearing age, and did that for several years. And then I ended my career after working with Center for Health Training, now called CARDIA, and I was the Title X training manager there for nearly 5 years. Title X is family planning money from the government, from the Office of Population Affairs. And so that's family planning money that provides birth control, pap smears, things like that. Planned Parenthood receives Title X money. It's not supposed to be used for abortion, but we are seeing that the abortion industry uses Title X as kind of a gateway to get customers in the door for abortion. I was also trained by the CDC and the Office of Population Affairs. So my whole career in comprehensive sex education was a span of 10 years. And so you see there, a lot of my education and time was spent in the homosexual community, going to gay pride parades, organizing the parades, talking about the prevention of HIV and AIDS, talking about reducing the risk. So as you see some of the pictures there of condoms and lubrication, and how to talk to children about this very same message. So, does comprehensive sex education sexualize children, and how are they sexualized? So this is a quote from my mentor at Planned Parenthood in Austin, Texas. She sat me down at her office to begin my training, and she said, Monica, when you walk into a classroom of children, imagine that they've done anything and everything when it comes to sex, and if they haven't, they will. And it's your job as a sex educator to explain all forms of sex, all forms of sexual activity, and teach them how to reduce their risk by using condoms, getting tested for STDs, getting treated for those STDs, and referring to Planned Parenthood for abortions. This is her quote. This is the agenda behind comprehensive sex education. It is to sexualize children. It is to teach them all forms of sex and to practice risk reduction. In other words, teaching children to engage in high-risk sexual activity, and then teaching them how to use condoms, lubrication, and because they know that condoms are not going to work, they teach them how to navigate the healthcare system by going to Title X agencies, HIV agencies, STD agencies to get tested and treated for STDs, and then inevitably get their abortions in Planned Parenthood. That is the cycle of comprehensive sex education. It's not about critical thinking skills, it's about learning. They're literally teaching children the steps of becoming sexually active, how to negotiate risk reduction, and then navigate the healthcare system. So one of the first things that she told me was that although she's claiming that many children are sexually active, she also said that they were not going to be receptive to talking about sex in the classroom because they're inhibited. So she taught me this icebreaker, which is still an icebreaker being used today. And as you see on the screen, there's all kinds of inappropriate words there. And so what the activity is is that when we would be in a classroom of kids, we were instructed to ask them to shout out all the names of the body parts and sexual activity, whether slang, it didn't matter, just to shout them out. And either I would write them on a board every time they shouted them out, or I would give them a marker and they would write it on the board themselves, or they would get Post-its and write it on Post-its and put it on the board. And there's always a few kids, you know, they're hesitating. They're like, I don't know if I'm supposed to say this, but the adult in the room is telling them to do it, and so they do it. And so after a while, even the quiet ones, if they're not shouting out inappropriate terms about people's body parts, they're at least giggling. And so this is an exercise to break down their inhibitions. This is the icebreaker she taught me to use specifically to break down their inhibitions. And this is really similar to what Alfred Kinsey did. And we'll get into that a little more as well. Actually, let's focus on that one a little bit. And so what we see with Alfred Kinsey is that he talked about, or what he created was something called the sexual attitude restructuring, SAR. And that is actually something that's still being used today by sex educators. They're still being trained. Sex educators today who are being trained to become sex educators and get certified are actually still going through a breakdown of their inhibitions through the sexual attitude restructuring. It is an ongoing training for indoctrinating adults as well as children to expose them to large amounts of really sadistic, depraved sexual videos and images to break down their inhibitions. And it's changing their minds, their values, and their behaviors. And it's very much like social emotional learning, where it's deconstructing a person, a child, or an adult's a worldview and reconstructing it with a new worldview. And that's what this is doing. And that's what comprehensive sex education does. And so what's the goal of that? It's to normalize childhood sex. It's to break down their natural modesty, to deconstruct their family-given values and beliefs, and to reconstruct with moral relativism. It is to teach children in society that children are sexual from birth, that they have sexual rights, and that no one should keep them from expressing themselves sexually. So I want you to ask yourself this question. Who in all of the world, in our society, would say or try to keep children from having sex? Who would be the barrier of allowing children to have sex? And if you answered parents are usually the people who are trying to keep their children from having sex in childhood, then you're right. So when this movement of comprehensive sex education, this movement to sexualize children, is saying that children have sexual rights and that they have this human right to have sex and to enjoy pleasure in sex in childhood, they're essentially saying that it's the parent who is the oppressor. It's the parent who's the bad guy, because the parent is the one trying to protect their child from having sex. So here we start to see that a wedge is being created between parents and their children. Talking about moral relativism, what is moral? Relating to standards of good and bad behavior, fairness, honesty, etc. What each person believes in. These are from the Cambridge Dictionary. Relativism is the belief that truth and right and wrong can only be judged in relation to other things. Nothing can be true or right in all situations because it is created by each individual. And so comprehensive sex education is focused, their standards are moral relativism. It is not about objective truth. It is whatever is true for that person. It sounds very fair, I suppose, the way it's communicated to children. But we all know that what it's really doing is it's teaching our children to be engaging in high-risk behaviors. And so this standard, and as Missy mentioned earlier that Alfred Kinsey is the father of sex education, he absolutely is. When I was being trained by Algo Informicida, over and over throughout the years, they always said, we're so grateful for the father of sex education, Alfred Kinsey. If it wasn't for him, we wouldn't have the Kinsey scale of homosexuality. You know, we wouldn't have this, you know, we wouldn't be, you know, we wouldn't have these binaries, you know, to get rid of this binary belief that you have to either be homosexual or heterosexual, but you can be something in between, including in gender. And so that father of sex education, and as you heard earlier, that Alfred Kinsey was a pedophile, and all, you know, and his research was really about trying to justify his depraved sexuality. But somehow our government fell for it, and they took his research and they changed our laws. They changed how the medical community views children and sexuality, and it changed how the American Psychological Association views children and psychology. And here we see that they even created sex education standards. And so the National Sex Education Standards were created actually by FOSI, the Future of Sex Education. You see that there's 3 logos of 3 organizations, Advocates for Youth, Answer, and CSE, who created them. But it was actually a large group of people, including a group of organizations, including the training organization that I worked for, the Center for Health Training. And these are the standards. So I want to pause here with the National Sex, NSES is what I'm talking about. So some states, and one of the recommendations, oh wow, I'm running out of time. Some states are wanting to, working towards making sure that the NSES, or National Sex Education Standards, are not part of their education in their states. And so I think that's a really great way of doing it. Instead of trying to look at each individual comprehensive sex education program, just see if they're using these standards and if they're using risk reduction. And if they are, then you know it's comprehensive sex education. What they're using in NSES is social learning theory, social cognitive theory, and social ecological model. All that really means is that you're learning from your environment. And if your environment, in this case, is comprehensive sex education, and if the school's environment is about sexual freedom, then this is what the children are learning. This is basically what Alfred Kinsey did with the SAR model. We'll skip through some of these because I don't have enough time. And this is just as far as some images that you'll see with comprehensive sex education. They're promoting that gender is not binary. They're promoting that there's Sean there in the center with some sunflowers. He's a sex educator for Planned Parenthood. He says that he wants people to know that STDs are perfectly normal and that you shouldn't be ashamed about getting an STD. It's a normal part of life. So they're normalizing disease. They're normalizing childhood sex. They're normalizing that gender is not binary. They're normalizing abortion. And all of this eventually will lead to social change. So our children are now going, a whole generation of people are going to have different values that are contrary to family values. We're going to see the breakdown of family, and that is what we're seeing. And these are just, again, just examples of what comprehensive sex education looks like. And so I wanted to point out the difference, the similarities between what the FBI states as being child predators and some of the ways that they groom children, and compare that to how comprehensive sex education does it. And really, it's introducing the child to sex, introducing them, demonstrating sex acts to children, lowering their sexual inhibitions, desensitizing children to sex, and then sexually arousing the children and engaging in sexual activity. And this is very similar. And again, this is just a slide talking about how it changes the values and behaviors of children, from believing that they're sexual from birth, seeking sexual pleasure, not marriage, but that it's really dehumanizing. Much of it is about dehumanization. And it has adverse outcomes with, not only disease, but also we're going to see a lot of mental health, negative mental health outcomes coming from this as well. And it's really the breakdown of the family that we're seeing when we begin to dehumanize one another. And as children start to dehumanize each other and themselves through having sex outside of marriage and in childhood, it's a natural next step to start dehumanizing the preborn child. So this is why abortion has become so normalized among youth. Although we're seeing a huge change in that today because of science, because our children are seeing that there is life in the womb. But what we're seeing here is that parental rights are being diminished by this movement of social change. And so these are some quotes from various individuals. So Planned Parenthood says, parents are a barrier to our services. Once a parent knows that their child is coming to our clinic, we never see that child again. Bill language, removing parental rights for transgender affirming care. Parents are a barrier to their children's health care. That was actual language in a bill in Texas. Parents as partners. You see that in the whole school, whole community, whole child initiative. They call parents as partners. We're not partners. We partner, parents partner with others if we want to, but schools do not. They don't partner with us, we partner with them. So some call to action is strengthen your family. Make your family first, your children a priority. Make sure that you're the expert for your child. And in your community, getting involved in your school, getting involved with legislature, getting involved with your church. And with all of this, it's so heavy, it's so dark. And really, you know, I'm a Christian, and so one of the things that I always go to is this scripture where it seems so heavy and dark, we don't know what to do. And Jesus himself says, but this is the kind that does not go out except by prayer and fasting. And we need to be in prayer and fasting along with taking action to overcome this attack on our children.
Thank you so much, Monica. That really, I remember when you sent me the slides to look at, I was uncomfortable just looking at the slides. And the fact that this is presented to our children is just absolutely horrific and just so wrong. And again, not the sex ed that I thought it was. Like I said, it's not the sex ed you probably thought it was either. So it's interesting the way that you said the cycle of CSE. It almost sounds like a pipeline as well. Like they're forcibly, or it's an agenda. It's getting them into the clinic. It just was really fascinating. So our next guest I'm excited to introduce is Erin Brewer. She's the founder of Compassion Coalition and co-founder of Advocates Protecting Children and is dedicated to educating on the harms of gender ideology. As the author of Always Erin, Transing Our Children and Parenting in a Transgender World, she has established herself as a compassionate thought leader on the topic. With a BS in Communication and Cognitive Science from Hampshire College and an MS and PhD in Instructional Technology and Learning Theory from Utah State University, she has spent the last 5 years analyzing comprehensive sexuality education programs worldwide, establishing herself as a leading authority in the field. So please help me welcome Erin.
Well, honestly, if you had asked me 10 years ago if I'd ever be talking about a topic like this, I would have thought you were crazy. I used to help with fundraising for Planned Parenthood, and for most of my life, I was a hardcore leftist until I started doing research and finding out what it is that our children are being taught in the schools. And as much as I would rather not talk to you about this and show you some of these very graphic images, I think it's important for parents to know what their children are being exposed to. And if we're a little bit squeamish about adults seeing this, and if I'm squeamish talking about it, imagine how the kids feel. So first I wanted to talk a little bit about comprehensive sexuality education entry points, because a lot of times now this curriculum is getting insinuated into the schools under the guise of HIV prevention, anti-bullying, suicide prevention, job training and life skills. All kinds of topics that sound very innocuous are actually entry points for comprehensive sexuality education. So Monica talked a little bit about grooming, and I want to go into it a little bit more. The Oxford English Dictionary says that the practice of preparing or training someone for a particular purpose or activity is grooming. And I think that you'll agree with me after I go through my slides that comprehensive sexuality education as it is being taught these days is in fact grooming children. David Finkelhorn is one of the experts in sexual abuse of children, and he talks about sexual abusers, and their goal is to overcome the child's resistance by breaking down a child's boundaries. And that's what comprehensive sexuality is doing. Finally, we have the United States Federal Appeals Court opinion that grooming is the reduction of a child's inhibitions in order to prepare the child for sexual activity. So comprehensive sexuality education is grooming because it basically uses the same techniques that sex offenders use to groom children. It prepares children to engage in sexual activities, and it intentionally or inadvertently prepares them for sexual activity. Oftentimes, teachers and other adults may not recognize how the curriculum that they're teaching is actually grooming children. And comprehensive sexuality education results in grooming because it exposes children and normalizes sexual behavior. It violates their boundaries, introduces them to very sexually explicit material. It alienates children from their parents and caregivers over and over and over again in comprehensive sexuality education. They will refer to trusted adults that children should go talk to rather than their parents. And it encourages children to believe that they have a right to sexual pleasure, that this is an inalienable right that they have as children. So let's start out with the sex positivity message. And this is something that is just infused in all of the comprehensive sexuality curricula. And the idea is that sex is fun. It feels good. And the only concerns that we have is that there are these unpleasant complications that can happen that we need to be aware of, such as pregnancy and sexually transmitted infections. And so that's the messaging behind this, is that sex is fun. You just have to make sure you don't have these unpleasant complications. This here is Be Proud, Be Responsible. It's funded by the Personal Responsibility Education Program through the United States federal government. It's one of the more conservative sexuality education programs that's in our school these days. You can see many states have adopted it, and it's for ages 14 through 18. Generally, it's seen as one of the less concerning curricula, but even this one talks very explicitly about vaginal, anal, and oral sex. It talks about how to use condoms in a way to make sex more pleasurable, and it encourages the gender ideology, the idea that girls can have penises and boys can have vaginas. The thing that this does, and that almost every single comprehensive sexuality education curriculum does, is that it takes this material that may not seem as concerning, and it refers children to other resources that are incredibly concerning. So I have parents tell me regularly, oh, we don't have that in our state. We don't have this really explicit comprehensive sexuality in our state. We use this manual that's been approved. It's abstinence-based. Well, what they don't recognize is that these manuals refer children to incredibly explicit websites and other materials. So I'm just going to go through those. This is a diagram from this one particular curricula of all the different places that children are referred to in this manual. The first is Sex X, and it talks about very explicitly and in cartoonish ways anal sex. It talks about birth control superheroes. Being transgender is perfectly normal. So, and you can see it's really appealing to children because it's using cartoonish imagery. And then we have Planned Parenthood. What is sex? Well, it talks about vaginal sex, and again, they're even here we're introducing some of the gender ideology because they don't talk about men and women or boys and girls having sex. They talk about penis and vagina intercourse because According to the transgender ideology, girls can have penises. So the language they use is very contrived. But they also go into fingering and hand jobs and dry humping and genital rubbing and masturbation, stuff that is very explicit that I don't think most parents feel comfortable with their children being exposed to, especially without context. So that the parents can make sure that the children are understanding sort of all this very titillating and language really designed to break down these children's boundaries. Again, you can see it's appealing to children. It's very cartoonish. We have dildos here and all the different things that can penetrate a hole. Again, this is desexting male and female bodies and just talking about various holes that can be penetrated. We have, this is one of their big projects. It's a number of videos, and this one particularly is talking about, is it normal to watch porn? And again, these videos are often showed in conjunction with a comprehensive sexuality education, that a parent might have looked through the manual and didn't see anything really concerning. They didn't realize that their children were also going to be seeing videos like this. Is it normal to watch porn? Yes, they say. And then they have something like this. Again, very cartoonish, obviously appealing to children. And in my view, very offensive. Then we have Planned Parenthood. This is their website, and they have a number of curricula specifically for teenagers, for parents, for teachers. This one talks about, again, very explicitly, oral sex, anal sex, various kinds of sexual pleasure. And then it talks about sex work is when a person willingly takes part in exchange of sexual services for goods and money. And it's interesting because I have been taught that consent cannot be coerced. And if you have to pay someone, that is considered coercion. But now Planned Parenthood is coming out with its new definition of sex work and suggesting that someone can willingly engage in transactional sex. And they're teaching this to children. They also talk about sexting as a way to flirt, as if that might be an appropriate way for children to engage in flirtatious behavior. These are some of the very graphic images that they will see in this particular curricula. And again, I thought that I had been exposed to a lot, but when I see this and recognize that children are being shown these kind of images, it's disturbing. And again, we have porn can be fun. People can use it to get aroused. And again, some very explicit images. And then scarletine, almost every curricula that I've looked at refers children to scarletine, and I haven't quite figured out their funding. They claim, they claim that that this is run by children for children, which is even more concerning because there's got to be adults in there somewhere. But again, they're teaching children how to make BDSM toys. They call it. This is basically normalizing very brutal kinds of sexual behaviors, teaching children how to make sex toys out of common household objects. This is some of the topics that they have: transgender, BDSM, polyamorous relationships, and fisting. Fisting is a brutal sexual act that can cause incredible damage, especially to children. And again, they're presenting all of this as if it's peer-to-peer. It's teens, for teens, by teens, and again, referred to by many of the sexual education curricula. And then Scarlet Teen sends kids to sites like this, which is essentially a sex toy website, an online website for sex toys and other various sexual objects. And it's an over 18 site. And so we've got just 2 degrees of separation from something that is a website designed specifically for adults. Then we have Bedsider, which is another site that is very often referred to in these comprehensive sexuality education manuals. And again, these are in manuals oftentimes that look fairly innocuous, that a parent might look through and say, oh, this isn't too bad. But they don't go to the website and see what the kids are going to be exposed to. The interesting thing about Bedsider is it specifically says it's for 18 to 29-year-olds. It's operated by a power to decide, and it is incredibly sexually explicit and designed, it's almost erotica online. The fact that we have government programs that are sending children to an over 18 website is shocking to me. And, you know, this is just one of the examples where it talks about visualizing the sexuality you want to manifest. As you undulate your hips during sex, visualize a spiral of erotic energy forming in your pelvis. I don't think any child needs to be exposed to this. And the fact that this is an over 18 website that our children are being referred to is incredibly concerning. And then Bedsider refers children to Good Vibes, which again is an over 18 website specifically for adults. And it's a Babeland, this is sex toys, talks about anal beads, dildos, all kinds of very sexually explicit materials. And it's not just in the US. So UNICEF actually has manuals. This one is for kids age 10 to 19, where they're referred to sex ed and Scarleteen and Planned Parenthood websites. So this is where I think parents need to understand how concerning this is that UNICEF somehow has gotten indoctrinated to believe that it's appropriate to teach these kinds of materials to children, and it's hard to imagine how that happened. I remember as a kid, I used to think of UNICEF as feeding starving children and providing medical care, not sexualizing them. This particular manual is Plan International. It's for all ages. So this is a manual. It's very fun. It's very colorful. It's cartoonish. It's called Putting the C in Comprehensive Sexuality Education. And again, sending kids to Scarleteen and Amaze. Amaze was the one that did the video on watching pornography as normal for kids of all ages. This one is another international comprehensive sexuality education for young people. Young people is another one of those terms that's being used in order to normalize sexuality for children. So we don't call them children or kids anymore. We haven't called them people or young people. And that's a way to separate adults from really recognizing this isn't for young people, this is for children. And again, this manual refers children to Scarleteen, Planned Parenthood, Bedsider, and Advocates for Youth. This is another manual. This one is funded by a group it's for kids 11 to 24, and it's in California. A lot of times the funding on these organizations are really hard to track down. That they're kind of it's like those cups where you have one cup and another cup and another cup, and you take one off and you realize at some point all of this is very interconnected. But this manual, again, for kids in California 11 to 24, is for Planned Parenthood, Scarleteen, Good Vibrations, and Advocates for Youth. And another thing that they do that's really concerning is they do this grouping. So you have children aged 11 to 24 or age 10 to 29. You have these grouping of, what are very young children and adults. And so that's one of the ways that they justify putting this very explicit material in there. This particular manual is funded by the Center for Disease Control, and it refers children to Bedsider, Advocates for Youth, and Planned Parenthood. It says manhood, but it's really designed for boys. And this is Teen Source, which is supported by the Office of Population Affairs. It's a Title X grant. Again, federal money. It's an online source, and it refers kids to Scarleteen, Planned Parenthood, and Sex Ed. And another one. This one is the granddaddy of them all. It's a Office of Adolescent Health. Federal funding. It refers kids to all of those organizations. And we have this one in the Department of Health and Human Services, referring, again, kids to adult sites. So the reason this is so concerning is that all of these things result in the early sexual behavior to children. And we've lots of research to show that when children engage in sexual behavior, that they have a higher risk of suicidal behaviors. They're more likely to use tobacco and alcohol. Basically, it puts them in a much higher risk category than they otherwise would be. So So some people might agree, yes, sex is pleasurable, it's fun. What's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that it increases suicidal behaviors. It increases tobacco use. It increases alcohol. It also increases the risk of sexually transmitted infections, which can be HIV, which is a deadly infection. It also can result in an unplanned pregnancy, which can be incredibly traumatic to a child. So all of these things have huge implications. It's not just that there's, some prudish people who don't want children to be exposed to sexuality. It's that these behaviors have serious outcomes, serious consequences, and it's not just sexual transmitted infections. It's not just pregnancy. It's a lifelong experience. Once you're sexualized as a child, you can't go back and regain your innocence. And so I just want to, kind of reiterate that these are grooming behaviors that would be red flags if they were perpetrated by strangers in a playground. If there was a child who was sitting in a playground and someone came up and showed them the materials from many of these manuals, I'm guessing the police would be called and that person would be carted away for exposing children to harmful materials, and appropriately so. When I go out and present on this, I often give warnings to people about how explicit the material is, because it is difficult for people to see. It makes them very uncomfortable. Well, imagine what that's like for children. So we would recognize, if a stranger walked up and told your child, hey, watching porn is good for you. It's fun and it can help you to understand how to increase your sexual pleasure. I'm guessing most of us would recognize that as predatory behavior, and yet we have teachers telling our children this, which is even in some ways worse, because it breaks down the boundaries between someone they should trust. So again, teachers are unknowingly grooming children, oftentimes making children much more susceptible to sexual abuse by other children, by their peers, as well as by adults. Programs that appear to promote health and well-being are often smokescreens for promoting the sexualization of children. Again, I have parents tell me all the time, oh, this isn't happening in my schools. And then I show them where these manuals are referring children to go. And generally, it is shocking to them. Finally, this is the U.S. government that is both overtly and covertly funding these sites in the U.S. as well as internationally that promote risky sexual behaviors. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Missy for our next speaker.
Thank you so much, Erin. Wow. So I was actually surprised. I don't know why. I think maybe because I've been researching now so much and it feels like, how could this not be an intentional thing? But it is a good reminder that many teachers may not actually realize that they're grooming kids for sexual behavior and sexual exploitation. And I know, Monica, you even said that you thought you were doing the right thing. You thought this, and that's what we learned also in last month in gender ideology, that so many therapists believe that this is the right thing. So we do have a lot of true believers out there because they've been taught incorrectly, which is just absolutely terrible. I'm still blown away also with the proof of so much risky behavior or sexual behavior for children when it's early, how bad the results are. We have the proof, and yet we continue to do this and push it, as you noted, internationally. And I'm very excited to bring up our next speaker who has a lot of experience dealing with this internationally. Well, all of our amazing speakers too. And so Rebecca Ose is the Director of Research for the Center for Family and Human Rights, or CFAM, in Washington, D.C. She earned her doctorate in genetics and molecular biology at Emory University. And among her focus areas are global maternal and child health and family planning. And her articles on these topics have appeared in such publications as The New Atlantis, The Hill, and the Christian Journal of Global Health. So please help me welcome Rebecca.
Well, thank you so very much. It's a delight to be here. And let's see. So I would like to sort of build on what you've already heard from our previous speakers and kind of zoom out and focus on how all this CSE is being promoted, not just locally, not just nationally, but as part of a global agenda. And I think sort of if you take a philosophical look at what's been going on CSE and a lot of these other very controversial social issues, both nationally and internationally, it's really a battle for the hearts and minds of society, beginning with children. And so I think we can sort of frame this as sort of two sides, broadly speaking. On the one side, we have sort of the more traditional cultural forces of family, religion, traditional values. And on the other side, we have the worldview that is both the source and the providers of CSE. So just, in general terms, what we're talking about is, on the one side, we have the understanding of the family as the fundamental natural group unit of society, and the idea that parents are the primary educators of their children, and that we understand sexuality as a topic sort of within that context, that the general purpose for it is the bonding of parents to each other and the reproduction of children, right? And the idea is that human rights, as we have in our founding documents in this country, are God-given, they're inalienable, and they are intrinsic to our humanity, and the role of the state is to safeguard the enjoyment of those rights, not to provide them, and certainly not to impede that. But on the other side of the wall, we have the vision that I call the vision of CSE, which basically says that the family is not any one particular thing. It can be constructed however you like. It doesn't have any particular status or definition. That sexual acts, as long as everyone involved is consenting, should be considered equally valid, and there's really no better or worse way as long as you have consent. And of course that the state, rather than the parents, are the primary educators of children. And in this worldview, sort of the replacement for traditional values and religion is human rights, but it's not the human rights as we understand them in our Constitution. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So in order to sell CSE to families, to schools, to politicians, there's a lot of various platitudes, a lot of things that are said to justify it. And I want to sort of go through each of these in turn, and then get on to how there is this agenda to make sure that CSE is inescapable in schools and out of schools, and is designed to be mandatory. So one thing that we hear a lot from proponents of CSE is that it is effective in producing good outcomes for young people, and maybe they say this is in comparison to curricula that teach abstinence only. And I don't have time to get into all of the studies, but I do want to point out one very important aspect of the way that effectiveness is measured. So we know from what you've heard before that the definition of CSE, as promoted by groups like International Planned Parenthood and CSE and UNESCO, that's the UN agency on education and science, that when they put out their curriculum guides, they're very insistent that it has to be very comprehensive and include all of these very controversial topics, including abortion as a right, gender ideology, and so on. And the idea is that you should not omit or downplay these topics, because that will lead to stigma and shame and people not being adequately informed. It's also been said, by UNFPA, for example, that CSE should not be presented as just value-neutral information. It has to be encompassed in basically training a set of values of gender equality and human rights as they define them. So CSE is supposed to be all of this. And yet, when it comes to setting up scientific comparisons, we see a very different definition of CSE is often being used. So for example, UNFPA in one of their evaluations said that for studying effectiveness, any program that teaches about contraception and condoms is considered as CSE. So that's obviously a very different way of framing it. Similarly, we've seen academic papers that point out that CSE is often used interchangeably with what we would call abstinence plus education, which is the kind of curriculum that emphasizes abstinence very strongly, while also including some information about some of the harm reduction, but certainly nothing as comprehensive as CSE. So one example of sort of an abstinence plus program is the ABC program that was rolled out in Uganda sort of during the height of the HIV epidemic there. And it says A for abstinence is your first resort, your most valuable. And then be faithful to one partner as a way of preventing the spread of HIV. And then as a last resort, as a backstop, use a condom, and that's C. And this approach was rolled out nationwide, and it's been credited with a lot of success in reducing HIV transmission in that country. And of course, this approach was criticized by some because of the heavy emphasis on abstinence. Now, this is not CSE as we've just been hearing about it from the previous speakers, and yet, when it comes to the evaluation, it would be lumped in because it includes that C element. So the bottom line here is that the evidence is very weak, honestly. If you look at even what UNESCO has written, that the outcomes are significantly better, or better at all in some cases, when you look at CSE versus abstinence-only education. But what you have to understand is that some of the more positive outcomes that we're seeing that are credited to CSE are in fact the product of more of these abstinence plus programs, which the CSE advocates would like to replace with their own much more comprehensive and controversial agenda. So we hear a lot about CSE being medically accurate and scientifically based, and I just want to look here really quickly. This is the sex ed standards that you saw earlier, and they include a definition of what they call medically accurate. And it includes ideas that it should be consistent with scientific theory published in mainstream journals. But I want to point out that bottom one there where it says or, not and, but or, recognized as accurate, objective, and complete by mainstream professional organizations and scientific advisory groups. And I want to get back to that in just a moment, but first I want to just briefly touch on the subject of what in fact is science. This is something that's rather close to my own heart as I was trained as a scientist, and when I say that I believe in science, I'm not making a radical statement. I believe that science is a very powerful and wonderful tool that can help us through experimentation and observation learn about the physical world and about what is. But what science is not prepared to do is to tell us anything about what ought to be. It's a very useful tool when used correctly, and it can tell us a lot about what is, but not about what ought to be. So anytime you are hearing statements about values or politics, these are not the product of science. That's not good science, it's not bad science, it's just not science. It's an abuse of science to call it that. So, getting back to these mainstream professional organizations and scientific advisory groups, I want to just look at a few of them here. This is not exhaustive, but just to give you an idea what they're putting their seal of approval on. So the American Academy of Pediatrics, for example, supports gender-affirming care for minors. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, they adopted a statement the same year the Supreme Court overturned the right to abortion, saying that in their view it is in fact a human right. The Society for Adolescent Health and Medicine opposes all legislation that would restrict access to puberty blockers or so-called gender-affirming care for minors. And of course, the American Public Health Association advocates for minors to be able to access abortion without parental notification or consent. So these are some of the groups whose approval is enough to have claims in CSE listed as medically accurate. And these professional gatekeepers have an important role despite the fact, or in fact because of the fact, that they're so politically captured. So they allow CSE curricula to claim medical and scientific accuracy by lending their credentials to these very extreme ideological positions. And of course, for parents and teachers who don't know better, this can provide them with a false sense of security that these things are actually, perfectly safe and good. And of course, it also provides the ability to paint opposition to CSE as being ideological, anti-science, and peddling disinformation and misinformation. So after what you've already heard, I probably don't have to say much about age appropriateness, but I'll just mention again, this all stems from the Kinsey idea that children are sexual from birth. We see this in a Pacific Northwest Planned Parenthood guideline, which says that sexuality is a part of life through all the ages and stages. Babies, elders, and everyone in between can experience sexuality. And this is obviously taken into practice by the 2016 World Health Organization European Office when they say that children 0 to 4 years of age have the right to explore gender identities and be taught about things like early childhood masturbation. So when sexuality begins at birth, there's literally no place too early to begin this. And this, of course, the inappropriateness can extend throughout. For instance, the CSE approved guideline says that second graders should be able to identify gender identity, different kinds of families, and gender role stereotypes. Again, I will emphasize what was already said, but a lot of what these curricula deem to be age appropriate is far outside of what mainstream parents would agree. So oftentimes you hear that CSE is being promoted as being culturally responsive or culturally relevant. And of course, again, what you would think that might mean is that it is tailored to the particular cultural identities and values of a particular community, that it's sensitive to the religious concerns, etc., when in fact it's really exactly the opposite. It's often tailored to break down and override what those values might be and reprogram them. So, for example, in situations when conservative values are prevalent and the majority, there's a very strong emphasis on centering minority interests, particularly marginalized communities, LGBT, etc. Whereas when more conservative values are in the minority, those same views that those conservative views are derided as basically being fringe and bigoted positions. I think one area where the cultural relevancy comes to bear most is actually with the training of the trainers. Because you realize that in a lot of these more conservative cultural settings, like this guideline here from East and Southern Africa, the people who are being tasked with teaching the children the CSE are people who are from that same community and who share that community's values. And so there has to be this additional step to really break down their own values and reprogram them. And so this guideline says, for example, that teachers have to recognize how personal values, beliefs, biases, and experiences can influence teaching of sexuality education and the importance of not asserting one's beliefs and biases onto learners. While, of course, simultaneously, these teachers are being told that they need to pass on the beliefs and biases that are incorporated throughout the CSE curriculum as a given. So these are a lot of the things that are being said about CSE, and hopefully this, provides a little bit of deeper context as to the reality behind all of those. I want to touch briefly now on the idea that CSE is being promoted as a human right in and of itself at the international level, and the push to make it mandatory both in and out of school. So there are a few independent human rights experts within the UN system who have explicitly come out and say that CSE should be treated as a human right, including the rapporteur on the right to education, who said sex education should be considered a right in itself and clearly linked with other rights, interdependently and indivisibly. So alongside things like the right to life, the right freedom of expression, and so on. And that document was cited 11 years later by the UN's independent expert on protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, saying that CSE should be part of the mandatory school curriculum and reach out-of-school adolescents as well. There should be no barriers to information, no requirements for third-party consent, that is, of course, parental consent, that this is absolutely necessary to destigmatize LGBT and individuals and so on. And so the idea here is that this should be inescapable and mandatory and, in fact, a human right. So, again, we have this sort of dueling narrative situation in the international context as well as here. At the UN, we often think about the UN as the General Assembly. We think about the negotiation of treaties and resolutions and things being adopted by consensus among delegates from various governments. And in those kinds of settings at the UN, CSE language is routinely rejected because there is no consensus that this is a good thing. On the other hand, there's an entire parallel system internationally, which is very much driven by the most radical claims from advocacy groups, and then incorporated into the reports of these various independent UN human rights experts and committees. And then you have agencies like UNESCO, UNICEF, UNFPA, the World Health Organization, who then cite those expert views in their own reports and in their own curricular guides, as we've seen. And in those contexts, CSE is not only accepted, but it is promoted very hard internationally. And of course, all of this is meant to feed into the idea that there should emerge ultimately a norm that, in fact, these things are human rights, even though countries do not agree to them. So the idea that this should be mandatory is something that has been taken up by the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights, who says that it should be, again, provided by law, be mandatory and mainstreamed, both in school and out of school. And particularly what this commissioner said is that international human rights standards on the right to freedom of religion or belief do not entitle parents to withdraw their children from these classes. So, again, this is where this goes ultimately. Of course, in the U.S., we do not currently have a national standard for CSE, despite efforts to make there be one. But, one thing that was mentioned earlier, the whole school, whole community, whole child model proposed by the CDC has been seen by many CSE proponents as an inroad into that, sort of the idea of creating schools as wraparound sites for provision of a whole wide variety of services. So the idea that this should be taught in and out of school really sort of envisions a couple different scenarios. One is where children, for one reason or other, are not in school at all. And the other is where children may be enrolled in school, but you can also reach them with CSE in other places that they spend time. So this could be, for example, digitally by phones or computers, but also in face-to-face settings, youth organizations, summer camps, religious organizations, and they include here refugee camps, which just shows how far this goes. And one thing that UNFPA says in one of its guidelines about out-of-school CSE is that it can include challenging topics and frame issues in a way that may not always be feasible or acceptable in school settings. So when you're away from the watchful eye of parents and even other teachers. Lastly, we've already heard a little bit about peer-to-peer CSE programs, so I won't get into that too far. But the idea here, we have to ask the question, how are these peers, these peer educators being recruited? What kind of incentives are they being given? What are they being asked to do? And of course, the idea behind this is that, you can't opt your child out of being told some talking points by another student on the playground. That's not something you get to opt out of the way you might in a formal classroom thing. So finally, one goal of all of this is to form a generation not only of children who've been indoctrinated, but also of activists. CSE's tagline, Sex Ed for Social Change, sort of, it is exemplary of that. For example, in their guideline, they think that by the end of high school, students should be able to to advocate for school and community policies and programs that promote, all gender expressions, gender identities, sexual orientations. We see similar language in the UNESCO technical guideline, which also includes activating students to advocate for reproductive rights, i.e. abortion, at the national and local level. So the idea here is that this is about training them to be activists as well. So one last point, I will say that the time is now for a real clarification of values, not the kind of values clarifications that rewrites people's values or asks them to suppress them, but to really think about what do we stand for? Are we on the side of tradition and family and liberty and the centrality of the family and parental rights? Or do we want to allow the vision of CSE to take over, which would involve the supremacy of the state over family, the constraint of religious liberty through this co-opted version of human rights, and ultimately, and I think this is really the goal of a lot of CSE, is the idea of bypassing a generation in terms of culture wars. Because if you can inundate children everywhere, in and out of school, from birth, with this stuff, year in, year out, on the playground, in the school, online, and everywhere else, the idea is that if you can really get hold of them and hold on, then all of these culture wars that are being fought by the adults today might be able to be won. By the time these children grow up, they will already be indoctrinated. And there are many forces standing against that, a lot of people, including hopefully many of you watching this. But really, it really comes down to the parents ultimately as the front line against this stuff. And I think it's important for those who are aware of this to be peer educators of other parents to get the word out about the harms of CSE. And I will end there. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, Rebecca. Wow, I I thought it was bad in America. It just absolutely blew my mind when I realized that this genuinely is a worldwide agenda being pushed on our kids. I think one of the scariest things that I'm so glad you talked about it, because it's something that we really, really need to be aware of as parents, is that, we can't just rely on opt out and then just check out and say, oh, well, we opted out, so we're good, because this next generation is being trained as activists. It's that quote, right, of get them while they're young and then you have them for life. And that's truly it. And it's scary to me, but it's important to remember that your kids are going to be influenced by culture all over the place. So just including on the playground, and when you have to step in as that first line as a parent. So, okay, I could go all night about this, but I'm so excited for the Q&A. We have some great questions already teed up, and I'm really looking forward to that. So, quick bathroom break for everyone at home. Submit those questions in the chat so that we can get started, and we're going to rearrange the stage, and we'll be right back. Thanks. Welcome back to M4LU's CSE 101. Tonight we have some amazing speakers, Rebecca, Erin, and Monica. Am I saying that right, Monica? Okay, you say it so nicely, and I don't have your accent. Sounds lovely. I am so excited for my favorite part, which is the Q&A, and this is just going to be a great conversation. We were talking earlier, and there's so much to cover. So first of all, I have to say the presentations were fantastic. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm going to start us off, and if at any point in time I am not directing a question to you, but you have something to say, this is an open floor, so please always feel free to jump in. The first one that I want to talk about, and I think all three of you have something to say on this, but Rebecca, you touched on it on the very end, is just this concept of values clarification. That just is kind of, I don't know, that's different. Where's that coming from, and why should parents be getting in front of values clarification at home? How can we?
Sure. Well, so the concept of values clarification first came up sort of as a way to get people to think about and be able to articulate their values that maybe they hadn't put into words before, but to be able to actually think about and say, this is where I'm coming from, this is what matters to me. But what we've seen, I've actually encountered this, in my international work, first in the context of abortion, where international abortion groups hold values clarification seminars for healthcare workers who might be involved at any level, even receptionists, et cetera, and having them, do these sort of group exercises that, in their case, they're not meant to clarify values at all. They're meant to impose a set of values. And they're very explicit about that fact. They're about trying to break down people's values and cause them to question them and then replace them with this alternative set of values. And so it really is, in the most explicit way, indoctrination.
You make a really important point there, I think, is that so many times we have not necessarily taken the time to really articulate and put definition ourselves. Like, it's the idea of apologetics, really, right? That you're able to explain it and how you really feel about it, not just, I feel this way because I was told that way or told to feel that way. So I think that's really important.
And I was going to add, I think in the context of comprehensive sexuality education, it really undermines parental authority and actually all of the authority figures in the child's life, because it really specifically says, let's talk about this. Let's see what you think. You don't have to believe what your parents taught you, what your faith leaders taught you, what your older siblings taught you. You get to believe what you want to believe. And then they make it clear what they expect everybody to believe. And so oftentimes there's huge peer pressure on these children to accept the values that are being presented to them. And it also gives the teachers an opportunity to talk about very explicit things. So they might say, what is your value? Is it okay to have anal sex? Is it okay to have oral sex? Is it okay to be engaged in BDSM? They might ask these questions, and that kind of gives them an inroad to talk about very explicit activities with children.
And it's also really this whole DEI thing. In other words, that you're not allowed to say that something is wrong. So really, even though they're asking those questions, the right answer is, yes, they're all okay. And you shouldn't judge someone for doing something. And so the only no-no in comprehensive sex education, or the thing that they really teach as well, is consent. So as long as you consent, then yes, it's okay for you to do all these things. And make sure you use a condom, and make sure you use lubrication, and make sure you go to all of the government-funded clinics that you don't need to ask your parents, or, because the government's going to pay for it. And so really when parents are looking at curricula, or if they hear the word, how to navigate the healthcare system, what they're really doing is teaching children not only how to engage in these behaviors, but how they can navigate the healthcare system or the government-funded clinics without parental knowledge or consent.
Is that what you mean by the consent side of it? So, because that I want to talk about next is what consent looks like.
Yeah. Well, I'll finish.
And how does a kid consent?
Yeah, that's another thing too. Well, with consent is really interesting, and this is a different part. I mean, without parental consent. But the way the comprehensive sex education teaches consent to children is in the affirmative. Will you consent to, did you give consent for anal sex or oral sex or vaginal sex, or to engage in BDSM, or to engage with multiple partners at the same time, and using devices and negotiating, condom use and blah, 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 and all of the details of all of that, as long as you consent. And it's always presented in the affirmative. And so what I recommend parents to teach is refusal skills. And so all of our states have laws that our children actually cannot consent to sex until they reach adult age. And so it's actually not legal for our children to consent to sex, because the state recognizes, parents have recognized, that it is not safe. It is a high-risk behavior for children to be engaging in sex. And so they're not even legally able to consent. So why would we have a curriculum teaching children to consent to something that they're not supposed to be consenting to? But we also know on a moral standpoint that it's not healthy for children to be engaging in sexual activity or to be even exposed to this kind of graphic information I don't think at any age. Anyone else want to add information about consent or?
Well, one of the things you mentioned was the importance of refusal skills. And one of the reasons that I volunteered to fundraise for Planned Parenthood was that when I was a teenager, I would go to Planned Parenthood and they would give me birth control pills, no questions asked, because I was brought up in a home that believed in sex positivity, that believed that sex was just a fun activity to engage in as long as you don't get pregnant or catch some kind of infection. So that was where I was coming from, and for a very long time, I sort of defended this, like, no, kids need to be able to gain access to these, to contraceptives, to condoms, to birth control pills. They need these testing services available because they can't say no. Because nobody had taught me how to say no. I had no concept that it was possible. And so I think that that's something that really, just sort of on an emotional level, makes me very sad about these curriculum, because these children are not learning they can say no, and here's how you do it. Instead, it's here's how you say yes, and here's how you prevent pregnancy and infection.
There's one more thing that I had spoken to a friend of mine who is now a leader in anti-trafficking. When she was a young girl, she was trafficked. And she's now a licensed counselor, and she counsels young girls that have been rescued from human trafficking. And I was having this discussion about consent with her, because I was really like, I'm having issues. This was some years ago. I was like, there's just something about consent I don't think is okay, because it's really teaching children to say yes. Do you consent to this? And it's always, again, the affirmative. And she's like, yeah, Monica, but they need to learn, that you have to be able to give consent. Or I said, but do children, should they be giving consent, or should they have refusal skills, saying a no? And she said, you know what? You're making a good point. And she said when she is counseling the minor girls who've been rescued from trafficking, from sex trafficking, she said, I'll admit, I actually don't teach them consent in the affirmative. I teach them how to say no, which is a refusal skill. I said, really? She said, that's true. She goes, I never use the word consent. I actually teach them how to say no without justification. It's a no, just no. That they don't have to give a reason for their no. They don't have to rationalize the no. They don't have to debate about the no. It's just no. You don't, and she even said, she goes, a lot of times kids, even adults, don't know why. They can't give you a reason, and that's okay. Just say no. And she said that traffickers are masters at getting children and adult women to give consent. Oh, wow. And so she gave me the example. She said so many of these young girls are being trafficked. They go to public school, or they go to school. They get a text from their trafficker to go somewhere after school. They go to that place. They're violated. And then they go home, and then they go back to school the next day. They are masters at being able to get people to consent to sex and to being trafficked. So when she rescues these girls and counsels them, she teaches them how to give a strong no, and without a reason. There's no reason, no conversation, just say no. So she said that yes, that refusal skills are powerful. And in that, what's so important is that if our children are being groomed to talk about these kind of very graphic, private things about their bodies and explicit behavior, sexual behavior with these strangers they've never met before, sex educators coming into their class, or just people that are not part of their family, period, then how would they be able to discern when a trafficker or another adult outside of the school talks to them about it? They're not going to be able to tell that there's something wrong with that. Because if the adults at my school or whatever are speaking to me in this way, so why is it wrong that this other person spoke to me this way who's an adult? And so it really starts to create confusion in a child, and it puts them at higher risk.
I think that's a really interesting and important point. And then I want to, and Rebecca, I think you have something you want to say in this too. I think it's important to remember we're not saying that there's not some level of knowledge that is important to tell. Like, actually, we talked about this a little bit in April as well, the concept of parents really need to be ready to have those difficult conversations, because you get like the first, what do they call it? It's the first mover advantage, essentially, in knowledge, that you become the person of authority to your children, whoever is the first person to share information on it. And parents have to be able to talk about these really difficult conversations, because otherwise, if you don't, then yes, it will be coming from somewhere else, and you really want to ensure that your values are passed on. And I understand, Erin, not all values are good to have passed on, but ultimately, I have to say, though, it's still the right of the parent to make that decision as opposed to the school. So that would...
Well, and it's really difficult when you have organizations like Planned Parenthood who are perfectly willing to bring a child in, provide them with services, and never ask that child, who are you having sex with and why? And that's ultimately the problem.
What did you want to have on that, Rebecca?
Just briefly on the subject of consent, I think we have to remind ourselves that consent is not the sole criterion of the good. That saying that you have to have consent when engaging in sexual activity is the lowest bar to clear. It is not the highest bar. And when we present it, when children in CSE are presented with the idea that consent is all that matters, there's so much that's missing from that. And even as they get older, even when they're no longer children, if that's what they've been taught, we see so many examples of kids who go off to college and they're engaging in these hookups with people who they don't really know. There's probably alcohol involved. Consent might even be dubious, but everyone's drunk, so nobody knows. And these people don't know each other, and they can't read each other's cues. And you can't see, is this person really uncomfortable, or are they just going along? And so you have all these people who are saying, well, I think I gave consent, but did I really? It wasn't good. The idea that this is something that can be good and life-affirming requires more than just consent. There's so much more. And again, when you teach people about the proper place of sexuality in family formation and what is actually good for you, not just legal, but good, it's a whole different picture. And of course, there is the flip side of that is some things will feel stigmatized, some things will feel shameful, maybe because they ought to be. But again, we need to bring back
shame back, I think.
Well, and the opposite, right? The good, the actually successful.
Yeah. So I want to circle back a little bit to... we already kind of talked about this briefly, but I just want to get your thoughts on it. So the most common claim I think that most people are going to receive anytime you try to fight against sex ed is the idea that, the parents aren't necessarily going to talk about it, so the schools have to. So how can we, as advocates, as parents, as moms, dads, grandparents, how can we push back and respond to the argument when someone we're talking to says, well, the parents aren't going to do it, so the schools have to?
I don't know if it's necessarily a pushback, but it is that parents are the sole authority over their children. And we're seeing in our country and across the globe that parental authority is being dismissed and demonized. I mean, parents are just being demonized, right and left. And we obviously through legislation, we need to ensure that parents continue to be the sole authority of their children. And then the next step is that parents do need to become educated on these topics, and then they have to do their own values clarification as well. And that's where I start with parents, because I've met a lot of parents who, when I do this in presentations, smaller like table talks, and I'll ask them, what do you believe you should be teaching your children about sex? Because they're all nervous about teaching their children about sex. And what's amazing is, a lot of parents think they're supposed to teach like Planned Parenthood does. Those are the responses. They think that it has to be graphic. And really, so we talk about that, and then we start talking about, how we can talk to children about sex depending on their values. I do it from a Christian worldview. And really, it's about reserving that for marriage and for family formation. But of course, even with that, we still have to become educated on what's happening in the community. Because what we're seeing is that children are being educated all over from their peers or the internet, whatever it may be. And they come home and parents don't have answers for them about the transgender, movement or whatever it may be. And then they start to think, my parents really don't know anything. And so, so we do have to become educated. This is what's so great about the university that you're doing here with Moms for Liberty and in other research that parents do, is you have to understand what's going on in the culture and be apologetics, be able to give your children an answer so that they realize mom and dad do know what they're talking about. And it's okay if you don't know right away. Say, hey, let's research, or give me a day. Let me research that a little bit more, and then let's go ahead and have a discussion about it. But I think the key is don't get scared, and so scared that you respond in a way that your kids now think they can't talk to you or they can't ask hard questions, even if they ask about anal sex. Like, you need to start getting prepared to talk about it, but know what your values are. And share your expectations with your children and protect them. By all means, protect your kids.
Yeah, I would encourage, I have 3 girls, as I've talked about in the past, and one of the things I said with them very young was nothing graphic, but just the idea of setting out in kind of like quiet times, that when we're driving in the car or, cleaning the house or something, that I tried to make sure to talk to them kind of about random things, but just so that it became very clear that we would talk. And that is a very intentional thing. And I think I hope most people who are watching this, care about that and want to do that. And I truly encourage it. Don't just push it off. Like, it's so important to talk to your kids.
Yeah, and I was going to say, if somebody uses that argument, first of all, I'd say good. I'm hoping parents aren't talking about all of this stuff at home with their kids, because kids shouldn't be exposed to all this. So that's, one of my responses is they're really setting this up in an unreasonable way, because there are going to be 1 or 2 parents, maybe out of 100, who don't teach their kids sort of basic harm avoidance skills, understanding how to be safe and healthy. But that's not an excuse to inundate these kids with sexually explicit material. So I really push back against that. And I think, as Monica said, also be willing to talk about difficult subjects. So if your kids do come home and they say, gosh, so-and-so was talking about this, that you can respond to it, and respond to it in a way that the children don't feel like they're bad. And I think that's really important, that kids sometimes, when these difficult conversations come up, kids can feel like they've done something wrong, and it's not them, and they need to know that. But also, just to emphasize, this is about health, this is about safety, this is about mitigating risk. And I think that kids are really responsive to that. We teach them to wash their hands. Why? Because we want them to be healthy. In the same way, we're going to talk to them about avoiding behaviors that ultimately could result in very harmful consequences.
Excellent points. Yeah, and tip of the hat that, or a preview, I should say, that our book club is going to be featuring "You're Teaching My Child What," and I will tell you, that is a amazing book, but a little bit hard to read. Not because of the language; it was very easy to read overall, but I was horrified at the behaviors and the risks that. The unhealthiness, and the fact that that's not being talked about is just shocking. It really is. I love that you both highlighted the importance of helping your kids feel really comfortable talking to you. I think that's really, really important. Okay, so another, as a follow-up to that one, are there any good resources to help parents then understand how to address sex and sexuality with their children, especially when they come back and, what if their 10-year-old does ask about anal sex? How do they respond? Or where can they find resources to help equip them with positive or good, better, more age-appropriate, truly age-appropriate ways to talk to their kids?
I think that's been a challenge for a lot of people to find something that matches their values or the way that they'd like to learn it. I mainly will teach parents through table talks or just even one-on-one, depending on what's going on with. Usually, I'm getting a phone call because something is happening at that time in their house, and so we talk through that. But there is a one that I like, Holy Sexuality by Christopher Yuan. Again, that one is a Christian-based curricula. And so I trust that one quite a bit. And so I think that's one that I would recommend.
I also think that oftentimes parents think they need these external resources to reinforce their messaging. I think parents really can explain almost everything that they need to know about sexuality without external resources. Really, we just need to teach kids how to be safe and healthy. And if you think through that and have it very clear in your mind, it's much easier to talk to kids about their sexuality. And it's funny because I said something to my daughter that I didn't realize had a huge impact on her. But I basically said, like, you should never have sex with a man who you don't think would make a good father, because
Good one.
he might end up being a father of your child. I had no idea how much of an impact that had on her, but she told me just a couple years ago that that was really important to her, and it made a huge difference. So I didn't have to go into a lot of detail. I didn't have to get really explicit resources. We just talked, and I think that that's something parents need to do more of and feel confident doing it without needing to get external resources.
I would agree with that as well. I think it should come very naturally throughout their lifetime, because you're teaching, or when my son was very young, I taught him about privacy. At some point, at some point, he got old enough where it wasn't appropriate for him to just walk into the bathroom when I was showering. But I use that as an opportunity to start teaching about privacy of our bodies. And so he couldn't do that to me, but now I couldn't do that to him either. And he, got to an age where he could bathe on his own. And so, I kind of started teaching him that, and teaching him that our bodies are private and that no one has the right to just come look at us or touch us or anything like that. So I even asked him, I said, well, I know you can't get out of the bathtub by yourself, because he was little, but he could bathe himself. I said, so when you're ready, just tell me and I'll, wrap you around like a little taco and get you out of the tub. And, but then I also use that as an opportunity to say, so if even mommy doesn't have the right to just invade your privacy that way, no one else does either. And so the way I taught him was that no adult should talk about your private parts, your body. He knew the names of his anatomy, but I told him that's the red flag. If any adult wants to talk to you about your body or look at your body, then you know that there's something wrong, and you need to start screaming for help and run. So only mommy has that right, and even I am going to ask you permission. Or if something's wrong, if something hurts, then you can give me permission to look. And it's interesting that when he became a teenager and was going through puberty, something did bother him, and he said, Mom, I need you to look because something bothers me. And so I asked him, I said, will you give me permission? He said, yes, please. And, and he was probably 12 or something like that. And he was fine. But you just start to teach your child that, and which is contrary to what comprehensive sex education is doing. It's saying any adult can talk to you about anything in any way possible. And that's a huge red flag.
I want to reiterate that, the idea that you establish yourself as a parent as a safe person, and that it is completely appropriate for kids to talk to their parents about it. And what Erin said, that we are the original experts, and you all said this actually, that it's okay. You don't necessarily need to be go into all this graphic detail and do all of that. We can explain so much with just the basics, and kids really don't need more than that, but they should feel comfortable. They should understand the difference between the safety of the parent, that adult, and that if it's outside that, that's not safe. And that's, I think that is the biggest takeaway, one of the biggest takeaways that I've had from this. Okay, so I have another one. This one is a kind of a tough one. What guidance can you offer to parents on how to proactively discuss sensitive topics with their children? So we're kind of already talked about that before these subjects are introduced at school, but even more so when a child is exposed to unexpected or graphic material, despite the school letter describing the lesson as quote unquote innocent. How do parents respond in that moment? For example, my middle school child came home disturbed by images that they couldn't forget, and what was taught went far beyond what the notice had implied. Given that we can't undo that exposure, what should the follow-up conversation with our child look like to support them?
That is such a hard question, but I think it's an important one because kids are being inundated with images. I can't remember the exact statistics, but talking about, how many children are exposed to pornography, and it's just incredibly high. So there's a very strong likelihood that your children will be exposed to explicit materials that will bother them. So I would suggest talking to kids when they're little, before it happens. Prepare them, let them know that there's a possibility that they will be seeing things that are not going to be healthy for them, and teach them to turn away, but also teach them to kind of process that. So I think talking to a parent about seeing it, I know that when people have trauma, one of the ways that they work it through is by talking to somebody about it and talking about their feelings. And so children need to know that it's okay that maybe they got aroused when they saw something, and that they can talk to their parent about that feeling and what it was like and how they should move forward with that and how they can avoid those kinds of situations in the future. I think that those are all possible ways. But it is really hard knowing that there's a very high likelihood that your child is going to be exposed to images that are explicit by the time they're probably 12.
I think my first reaction was kind of just to react as a mom, right? when I heard that question. And if it was truly, as the way the question sounds like, it truly was an explicit thing that was shown to the child. Number one, when I taught my son about puberty, it was because it was starting to happen, right? And so we were having those conversations, and I only taught him all that was good and pure and praiseworthy. And as his body was changing, I just said, hey, congratulations, your body's doing exactly what it's meant to be. That means you're healthy, you're on track. This is great news. You don't have to be scared, because it was kind of scary. And of course, given the fact that when he was young, I gave him that conversation that no other adult should be talking to you or doing these things, right? Because that is a big red flag. It's wrong. So I think if this happened at the school and he was exposed to something like that, number one, I probably would address it. Sounds like the child is upset, and I let them know that should have never have happened. Never. And I'm so sorry that happened to you, and I'm going to take care of it. And I would probably go to the police department. I know, we all know that nothing is happening, right? No one is going to stop the sex education. I mean, we're trying really hard. But you still have the right to report that to the police in detail of what happened, and at least there's a report on it. And if it's possible to press charges, I would. Because I think the only way we're going to change this is when there are real consequences. And the more reports are out there that children are being exposed to pornographic activities, conversations, etc., anywhere, whether it's at a clinic or your school or the park, whatever, or at after-school club, until there's reports and reports and reports, until we have that, I think it would help with, but it would definitely have the school know that we mean business, and I would do it. And that did happen at a church with our son, and so we did immediately go and we took care of it because we meant business, and we were shunned, of course, but our son knew that we were going to protect him because he came to us to report what had happened with a youth pastor.
I love that you validated the concern there by listening. Thank you for telling me that. I'm so sorry that happened to you. That's a good response I've heard for other types of therapy.
And that it's wrong. Yeah. It was wrong that happened to you.
Yes.
So it's not about a fluffiness, it's about that was wrong. Yeah. and you can tell from my voice, I'm just like my own mother, like authority. Yeah. I'm so, and I'm going to protect you.
And I know my kids, when they would come to me with things, well, when they got older in high school more in particular, they'd be like, oh, Mom, don't make a big deal out of this. Like, I don't want to be embarrassed and whatever, because in case anyone hasn't figured it out yet, I definitely am an opinionated person, and I don't have a problem letting my opinion be known. But it is important to do it in a good way, that and let your children really truly know that you are there to protect them and support them, and you're not trying to make their life harder. You're genuinely trying to take care of them. I think that's a big part too.
That's a really big burden for our children, and it's a burden they're not supposed to bear. Yeah. So no, you don't create a scene in front of your child with other adults, because that would just create an additional burden for your child. But you go take care of business on behalf of your child, because you are their advocate, you're their protector, you're their authority. So absolutely.
Yeah, that is such a good point. All right, so I have one that I'm going to go way, way back to the beginning, I guess this was more the middle of Rebecca's presentation. This was one that really stood out to me when I was reviewing things ahead of time. And it's because I think this is another argument that a lot of times can confuse or stop people in their tracks, and the idea that it's science-based, or that the science shows us that this, that, or the other thing. Because after all, we're moms, dads, grandparents, business analysts, project managers, teachers, hopefully good ones, and probably not scientists. So when someone comes at you with a claim that it's science-based, I love that you highlight the idea of it being the abuse of science. And we were talking earlier about manipulation of effectiveness and redefining those terms. So could you just talk a little bit more about that and how we could respond, whether mentally or what can we do to be prepared for someone coming at us with a science-based fact?
Well, first of all, that word fact, let's revisit that. But I mean, I will say this, you can add scientists to the list of things. If somebody comes at me with a claim that is not in an area that I have personally studied, I'm not going to know what that's based on either. Even though I have the background in science, that doesn't mean I'm an expert on all things science or science adjacent. So I think when somebody comes at you with a fact or a soundbite or something, you don't have to have a response to it right away. In fact, it would be shocking if you did, unless you were an expert in that area. And so I think, you can say, well, can you tell me that again? What is that? Where do I go find out more about this? Because I'm interested to know more maybe, and I'd have to look into it. But you don't have to have, a response on the spot. You don't have to refute it, or you don't have to accept it either. It's not one or the other. You don't have to disprove them, or on the other hand, say you must be right. There is a way you can say, that's something that I would have to look into more. It's interesting, and maybe if you have the inclination, you could maybe track down what the source for that is. Because a lot of times when you hear these very packaged sound bites, they have been crafted and packaged by advocates who are trying to prove a point. But if you actually go back and look at what that's based on, you will find a whole lot of caveats that are missing.
Well, so with that kind of idea, we were talking earlier about abstinence plus and the results, the numbers that are manipulated to push CSE, and you touched on this quite a bit, or a good bit in your presentation, but can you just or share that again, the way that you talked to me about it, of how abstinence is lumped in and the effectiveness of it is mistaken or incorrectly applied to CSE?
Sure. I mean, the idea is that, proponents of CSE, when they are trying to do these studies, will often lump in anything that includes any component of condoms or contraception as CSE for comparison purposes. And then, so a lot of programs that may include that content, but in a very strong pro-abstinence, minus a lot of the gender ideology, those kind of programs are, the ones that may be producing some of the better outcomes. And then the CSE advocates are grabbing that finding, and then they're saying, see, this is why we need CSE, because CSE is more effective. And then the practical upshot of that really is that, they will use that to advocate for the way more radical programs, which are then going to be in their, if they get their way, replacing the more effective, more abstinence-centered programs. So, it's an apples to oranges, or, the moving the cup, with the bean, it's really intellectually dishonest, but it's very strategic, right? Because they don't really have the evidence base to say that the full-on CSE is really that effective. And so they're borrowing wherever they can from things that seem to work and trying to pass that off as CSE in one environment and then replace it with the other thing after the fact.
Another thing that they do is they include, as positive results, an increase in contraceptive and condom use is considered a success. And now you think about that, and on the surface that might make sense, but what that means is if there's an increase in condom use and contraceptive use, that means there's an increase in sexuality often. And so you could have kids who had not had sex at all suddenly start having sex and using contraceptives and condoms, and that would be a positive result, so according to the science people are using. And so it's hard because as Rebecca was saying, it's really difficult to, if you don't have a background in this, it's hard to go through these studies and figure out the methodology and find out if the results are valid. There is a website called Stop CSE that has a really good breakdown on the science and how they use science, so-called science, to manipulate data, to make what is actually a negative result, which is more kids having sex, look like a positive result because more kids are using contraceptives and condoms.
And you also have to see that the way that they know children are using contraceptives or condoms is through self-report. And they don't necessarily are going to be talking to the same children 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, or even 5 years later. So that data is really, really sketchy. They might ask them 2 weeks later because they are in a class for 2 weeks or something like that. But as Erin said, it also shows that there were some children who were not sexually active who are now sexually active. And supposedly, CSC, they say, is to reduce the risk of disease and teen pregnancy. The truth is that they're just increasing sexual activity of the children. And so when you look at the data of, okay, so are you trying to just increase sexual activity with condom use, or are you trying to reduce disease and teen pregnancy? Because when you look at the results, there's actually either they have negative or null results when it comes to disease. And in Texas, there was the Texas Teen Pregnancy Prevention Program. I looked up all of the different programs that were doing that throughout the state of Texas and downloaded their information, which again was self-report, and it's teen pregnancy prevention. Well, in their surveys, they never even asked about pregnancy. So they never even measured the thing that they said they were trying to prevent. They only asked, did you start using condoms and how often? Oh, wow. And so there you go. Did you become sexually active and did you use condoms? Cha-ching, we can now tell our funders that we did our job and they're going to send us more money. And I think with the Abstinence Plus, what's going on is Planned Parenthood has an Abstinence Plus program. Why? Because they're a business. And this is about not only sexualizing children for social change, but also making money. And so if the money is with Abstinence Plus, they're going to have an Abstinence Plus program, which really is CSE. But we're going to talk about abstinence. So they're going to continue. So as you see now, Planned Parenthood is also getting money from the transgender movement. So they're giving out hormones, etc. So it's really about money and social change.
I also want to just make parents aware that the term abstinence has also been co-opted. And so oftentimes they'll talk about abstinence and they mean like it's okay to have mutual masturbation. That would be considered abstinence. Or they call it dry humping. Excuse the language, but this is what children are being taught, that's abstinence because they're not actually having intercourse. And that's concerning. I actually saw a manual where children were taught how to use sex toys, and one of the recommendations was to make sure that if they used a battery-operated sex toy anally, that the base was bigger so that it wouldn't get stuck inside the child and cause damage. So again, abstinence is, and I've also heard of like intermittent abstinence. So they're using these terms in ways that most people don't understand, and they're very manipulative.
That's horrifying. I mean, but also an incredibly important note on the co-opting of language. This is something that I'm very much looking forward to address in the future, but just the importance of language and being clear and speaking truth and knowing the definitions. Okay, I know we're getting to the end, and I have so many good questions I want to ask, but here's one that I think is really relevant, or, well, they're all relevant, but this was hopefully going to be able to be an additional call to action. You guys all gave such good actions afterwards, which I so appreciate. But what is a way to find out what CSE is being taught to our kids? Are there open resources, ways to find out without necessarily confronting the school? And my child is in 6th grade.
Yeah, I would recommend the Stop CSE website. They actually have a map. It's great. You can click on the state, you can click on the country, and it will show you exactly what is being taught in your state. As you know, as recently as, I don't know, we've updated, I guess, within the last year or two. This stuff changes, so it's not always completely up to date, but it's pretty accurate. The other thing you can do, believe it or not, is ask ChatGPT. Ask them, what's being taught in my state? It'll tell you. And so I think that there are resources out there. But again, if you see something that says it's abstinence-based, look into it much more. Don't just believe that it's actually teaching refusal skills, because I've never seen a curricula that actually was abstinence-based that was in the schools.
Stop CSE is a great website for all of that. I'll get calls from moms all over the country, and on the phone, I'll just tell them, let's walk through Stop CSE. Let's go to New York. Let's look at the laws. What does the law say for your area? Like New York apparently has different laws for New York's the city versus the outskirts. So it's really interesting. But what's really great about that is that you can also you learn about your laws, so you know how to advocate, and you're more aware of what kind of programs are in your school. But you can also connect with the person who is part of that organization that is in your state. So you can get additional support that way too.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to make one little just additional suggestion, which this audience might already be well and truly aware of, but that is, you can do whatever you can to monitor what's being taught in the schools, but don't forget that if your child has an internet-capable smartphone, they may be getting stuff even more explicit than what might be in the classroom. I think, obviously during the pandemic, a lot of parents were shocked to find out what was being taught to their kids because they were getting it, in the home. So obviously you have to monitor what's going on in the classrooms, but you also have to be aware of these other ways that they're getting to your kids because, like I said in my presentation, it's an in and out of school problem. So whatever youth clubs they're part of, whatever even religious groups they're part of, you have to check in there too.
You brought up the idea of the peer-to-peer advocates or peer trainers. I can't remember the term, sorry. But that to me was shocking, that is being done, that they're trying to push it in so many organizations outside of the school. So that is a really good reminder. Very, very good. Okay, any last final comment real quick? I know we're right at time, but any final comments? And please, let's go down the line and tell people where they can find you, any resources you want to share, anything like that.
Sure. Well, you can find me at monicacline.com or at takesafamily.org. And I just want to emphasize to parents that, you have more pull with your kids than you think. Kids may roll their eyes when you talk to them. You might think that they don't want to hear from you. But the truth is children want to be led and guided by their parents. They want you to set boundaries for them. I think every parent can, testify that they set some rules for their kids get mad, and a few hours later, they're like hugging on their parents. Why? Because kids really do want to be protected by their parents. And so just get educated, make sure that you're with other parents, like-minded parents, and getting the support you need, because this is a very dark battle, and you can't do it by yourself. And it's a burden too high for our kids, so you can't expect your children to do this fight with you. You really shouldn't. You're the one fighting for your kids, and you've got everything in you to be able to do it.
I have a YouTube channel called Truth is the New Hate Speech, so that's one way to get more information from me. But I want to just reiterate that you are your child's best advocate, and don't let social pressure undermine your authority with your child, because all around us we have messaging suggesting that, you know, there are other trusted adults who might be better suited to talk to your children, or that teachers should be doing this, or that they should be going to these websites to get information. And you need to really just feel very empowered that it's okay for you to stand up for your child and go into the schools and make a fuss if you need to, because ultimately these are your children and you're doing them a huge service for advocating for them, and you're also doing a huge service for all the children who don't have parents advocating for them.
Well, thank you again for this wonderful panel. You can find CFAM's work at www.c-fam, as in family.org. And my email is rebecca@c-fam.org. And, you know, I would just echo what the others have said, you know, that to empower parents to not, you know, to not fall into the learned helplessness that this is all inevitable and you can't do anything. And, you know, when you are in context of other parents, be a peer educator yourself, you know, bring things to mind that they may not be aware of, and spread the word.
I love it. And by the way, Rebecca has a ton of great articles. They are posted to the M4L, well, many of them, I don't know that I got them all, but posted to m4lu.org, our toolkit for CSE. You are an excellent resource for me. All three of you were. I like I said, this was a dark month. It was a dark month to research. You are a wonderful people, but it was a challenge and to go through this, and so I will echo that as well. Make sure you find people that are like-minded, because you need compatriots to get through this. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up our event. Thank you all so much. I am really looking forward to, believe it or not, the next events that we have coming up next week. On a week from today, actually, we'll have CSE 102, and we're going to have some fantastic speakers there as well. We have Seth Gruber from the White Rose Resistance, as well as Kelly Shenkoski from A Time to Stand. And before we go to that one, I would strongly encourage you, on the m4lu.org toolkit for CSE, we have linked in a 4-part documentary. Well, it's like a long-form interview of the mom who exposed the sexual cabal, something like that Seth Gruber did. It's absolutely incredible, and it really lays the groundwork for understanding CSE and the national or international agenda that's being pushed. So I strongly encourage you to watch that. It's very, very informative and will be a great precursor for next week. After that, on Monday the 19th, we will have our watch party with Family Watch International's The War on Children. And that comes from stopcsc.org. That is an affiliated location, and it is just incredible, exposing what is happening internationally. We will be featuring Sharon Slater and Audrey Werner. So we have, again, some fantastic speakers, and we're already preparing. We're going to be talking about things really empowering you on how you can fight back and what you can do next. So that's going to be the big focus then. And then finally, on Tuesday, May 27th, right after Memorial Day weekend, we will be doing our book club discussion of You're Teaching My Child What by Dr. Miriam Grossman. This is a really, really informative book. It is a very easy to read book. It is challenging in that it is hard to know that this kind of information even exists, and also that it's not being taught to kids. But I strongly encourage you to read it. It's very easy to read, and Dr. Grossman is absolutely a fantastic speaker as well. So please consider joining Moms for Liberty as a member. We are continuing to build our resources, and we really appreciate all your support, as that helps us bring more amazing guests like we've had tonight. So that, again, wraps up our evening. Thank you so much for joining us at CSE 101, and we look forward to next week.